Okay. So, Sister Paulette, you can see us, but no one else will see you. The person who's speaking is who will show up on the YouTube feed. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Father Aaron Gerlach, coming to you from Old Trinity Episcopal Church in downtown Tiffin. We are doing our diligence in being socially, and I shouldn't say socially distanced. We're very connected socially. We are physically distant. Michael's at his home on the other part of town in Tiffin, so that's why we're not wearing masks. We're not in the same space. I'm the only person in the building tonight, and Michael's at home with his household. So we're doing well on that front. In fact, that's why this presentation is happening this way tonight. Michael had this idea of doing this presentation on policing, which he thought might speak to our current situation, and was looking around town where we might have it at the library, which is not able to host presentations at the moment. And then we got talking about various locations, thought about maybe an outdoor location that might be a safer venue, and then we stumbled upon doing this live. So hopefully all of you enjoy the presentation tonight, and as I said, use the chat feature. Let us know you're here, who you are, where you're from, any questions or comments you have while Michael's presenting. Michael is an assistant professor of history at Tiffin University here in Tiffin, Ohio, and is an Ohio native from Toledo, I believe, right? Yeah, and so that's all I have to say. I'll let Michael introduce himself a little bit more.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. And first, thanks to the Reverend Gerlach for hosting this event. As was mentioned, the social distancing guidelines put in place prevented a in-person talk. So I appreciate the opportunity to do this. I am a history professor at Tiffin University. I teach a variety of history courses there. And I'm an Ohio native from Toledo, Ohio, so close by to Tiffin. So Northwest Ohio is something that I'm used to. So I figured this would be a great way to reach out to the community of Tiffin in this time where it's an important time to have conversations like this, but then also in a time where it's the summer, it's an opportunity for us to learn and try to do something to improve, right, the community in which we live in. So I'll go ahead and switch over to the feature to share the PowerPoint. I'll be using a PowerPoint this evening to go through some of the issues that we'll talk about. So I'll pull that up if you could give me 1 second, and then I'll switch that over, and it should be showing up on your screen very shortly. So if it's appeared in your screen, you'll see up here is an image of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. along with a picture from a Black Lives Matter demonstration that took place in Ferguson after a tragic event there that we'll talk about tonight briefly. So the title of this presentation, The Fierce Urgency of Now, comes from a speech that Dr. King gave right at the March on Washington, his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And in fact, within the speech, Dr. King is going through a variety of issues, leaving this valley of segregation to the sunlit, mountain of freedom. I'm paraphrasing here. And what he mentions in the speech, right, and this is in the 1960s, is that achieving racial equality, economic justice, all of those things, this is the fierce urgency of now. Well, here we are in June 2020, and we're still experiencing many of the issues that Dr. King went over in his speech. So this is the fierce urgency of now. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of different events taking place this summer right now as I speak, right, that we need to make sure we're aware of and that we need to engage with. So that's where the title of the talk comes from. And before we lead into that, I wanted to go over a couple of ideas and concepts just so that it will help to frame our discussion before I go into the presentation objectives for tonight. And for many of us who are watching this, and if someone's watching this overseas, perhaps in the UK, they may, this may not speak exactly to them, but this is mainly for individuals who are watching this in the United States. And as citizens or residents of a republic, right, the United States is a republic, it's our duty to learn the history of the United States. It's our duty to make sure that we're engaged with the history of our nation. And at times, when we learn about our nation's history, it may make us angry, it may make us uncomfortable, frustrated, perhaps even scared to learn some of the things about our nation's past. However, those emotional responses don't necessarily negate the need to learn history, because once we learn history, right, we can learn from it. And if we do learn from our nation's history, we can create a more just and compassionate future. And if we fail to learn from history, our republic will fail, and that wouldn't be a very positive outcome. So I just want to keep that in the back of our heads, because this is going to be at times, right, perhaps jarring, or it may elicit some kinds of emotional responses that are intense for you. But just remember that we're doing this to live up to the duty that we have as citizens of the republic, right, is to make sure that we learn about our nation's history. And due to the nature of this talk, it does have to do with policing. It does have to do with race in America, right? Obviously, I am a white individual, so I can only speak to this from the perspective of a historian. I'm not claiming to have, a personal insight into this other than a historical one, and that we must recognize, even if we live in a community like Tiffin, let's say, which you may have had if you live in Tiffin, very positive interactions with law enforcement officers. Personally, right, when I moved to Tiffin, my wife's Jeep had an expired license plate tag, and an officer came and instead of citing us, right, let us know that the tag was expired and gave us a couple days to do so, right? So that reflects the compassion of local police here, right? And then also perhaps the privilege that I possess as a white individual, right, not having to be worried about an encounter like that with a police officer. Now, in many communities across the nation, right, this is not the case. And we've seen this on TV over the last month or so, is that throughout history, and then particularly now, not all communities, right, have police officers who conduct their jobs with professionalism and compassion. And in some cases, right, commit unspeakable acts of murder and injustice. So we just also have to recognize, the reason I bring this up is that we may be watching this and you may be thinking in the back of your head, hey, I've only had positive interactions with police officers. So how true, is what everyone's mad about, or something like that. I assure you it is very real. It is very true. It's just that, maybe we don't live in those communities where things like that happen. So it is important to take a step back and recognize that. So as we get into this presentation, I wanted to put some objectives up on the screen to think about what it is we're doing today, what we're trying to accomplish here in this talk. And I'll try to be as concise as possible. I promise not to ramble too much, although it is a downfall of mine at times. But the first objective that we'll be doing tonight is to contextualize MLK's legacy within the fight for human rights, right? This is a talk about historical contextualization to make sense of the present day. That's one of the purposes of learning about history, as I mentioned before. So we want to see where MLK's legacy fits within the fight for human rights and how that can connect to current issues taking place in the United States. After we contextualize MLK's legacy, we're going to go into tracing the surveillance and policing of African American communities, how this surveillance grew after the Civil War. We're not going to be talking about the entirety of the nation's history, again, but we're not talking about a very focused couple of years in this presentation. This is we're talking about a big chunk of time here, right, from 1865 until the present. So we want to understand how the surveillance and policing of African Americans grew after the Civil War. So for my historian friends who may be watching, they may be saying, well, this has happened before the Civil War. And obviously you're absolutely right. Just for the sake of brevity, we're not going to get too deep into things that occurred before then. And then we'll review how policing and mass incarceration, the creation of the carceral state in the United States, how that intersects with race, but then also class, right? In the United States, oftentimes race and class overlap with each other. So we have to recognize class as part of this discussion as well. So we want to see the intersection there. And then we want to discuss the ways that MLK's fight for human rights remains relevant in this struggle today. And as a quick note, I must note that this presentation is merely an introduction to a variety of historical events and issues, and it's not an advanced discussion of historiography. So when I reference some books that help speak to some of these issues, you may be saying, well, wait a minute, why didn't you reference historian C's book, you've only did historians A and B. It's not that I am, trying to exclude certain historians. It's just for the sake of brevity, and that this is not an advanced discussion of historiography. Is just merely this is an introduction to a variety of different events and issues. So we'll get started, and then usually when I give talks in person, I would ask if there are any questions, but we're going to do the Q&A at the end. So I'll just go right into the presentation with a background on Dr. King, MLK, as he's popularly known. And he was born in the late 1920s, right? We still celebrate his birthday. That is MLK Day. And he completed his Ph.D. at Boston University in the mid-1950s. And really what I want to focus on in terms of his life for our presentation are some of the ideas he gained while completing his Ph.D. and then also some of the ideas, right, that came about after that and how he applied them to his own, fight for racial justice. And mainly, as we know, right, if you have some background info on MLK, is that he was heavily influenced by Gandhi's teachings on decolonizing the Indian subcontinent from British rule, the Raj, as it was called. And one of the important aspects of Gandhi's teachings is that in order to bring about change, one of the things Gandhi often talked about is doing civil disobedience and nonviolence, right? This is the easiest way for us to bring about change, according to Gandhi, because Gandhi is attempting to avoid a violent uprising against British rule. And Dr. King focused heavily on that idea, right, of civil disobedience and nonviolence, and oftentimes, right, would remind individuals what kind of fight he is interested in fighting, and that it would be a nonviolent, revolution, if you will. So throughout his career, right, he worked tirelessly to end legislation that segregated public facilities in the South, right? He's involved in the mid-1950s with a variety of issues, all the way from bus boycotts, right, to marches, etc., is that he's working to end legislation that supported segregated public facilities in the quote-unquote Jim Crow South. And we'll talk about that later on in the presentation, what that means and what that represents. And then we'll see what happened to Dr. King's ideas after he helped end segregation in the South. Now, one of his most famous speeches, right, is the I Have a Dream speech. This was delivered during the March on Washington. It's uploaded by the National Archives. You can watch it for free online. And that's, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, where the title of this talk came from, The Fierce Urgency of Now. Unfortunately, in the late 1960s, MLK was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, during the height of anti-war activism. There's actually a book by William Pepper, a very provocative book called An Act of State, where this attorney, William Pepper, demonstrates and researches how MLK, we should not think of him as being assassinated as much as him being executed, right? And that the government did not do enough to prevent his execution. After the execution of Dr. King, right, this is also during the height of anti-war activism, so there's a lot of civil unrest that had already existed that only became amplified after his murder. So unfortunately and tragically, right, his life was cut short, and we never got to see the full articulation and vision of what Dr. King had going into the 1970s. But we will talk about that very briefly. And this slide comes from a book by a historian named Thomas Jackson, From Civil Rights to Human Rights. And what Jackson shows us, Professor Jackson, is that throughout his years of activism, even before he got fully involved in the quote-unquote civil rights movement, MLK had focused on the difference between civil rights and human rights. And this distinction is important, right? Because as I mentioned, we need to understand the situation of mass incarceration and policing as a human rights issue, not a civil rights issue. And Dr. King, this is what he started to articulate towards the end of his life. And for a quick background, civil rights are rights that you get from the state being the nation state, not the state of Ohio or the state of Illinois or something like that. So for example, a person who lives in Canada, right, a Canadian citizen will have a certain set of civil rights that may be different from a citizen living in, let's say, Brazil, right? They may have different civil rights according to what those governments have given to their citizens. So for Dr. King, he focused on civil rights, But we also know that the struggle that he was fighting for extended beyond civil rights and went into human rights. And a human right, put simply, right, is the rights that you have simply for being a human being. By being a human, you have certain rights, notably life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, as we like to say in the United States, and then also freedom from slavery and a variety of other human rights. So although the Canadian may have different civil rights than the Brazilian, let's say, they both have the same human rights. And so by the mid 1960s, Dr. King starts to focus more on human rights in his speeches, right? Because we get the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act in the mid 1960s. The Civil Rights Act, of course, passes in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act passes in 65 as part of LBJ's Great Society to advance civil rights. After that, Dr. King starts to focus more closely on the issue of human rights, opposition to war, right? Dr. King became very vocal about the war in Vietnam. Also worker rights. Actually, when he was assassinated, he was getting ready to take part in a strike, a general strike, right, for Black workers, trying to secure better employment opportunities and wages, etc. In addition to workers' rights and opposition to war, human rights for Dr. King also related to anti-imperialism, right? He was influenced by Gandhi's fight against the British Empire, and Dr. King spoke vocally about the continued colonization of Africa by European powers. Now, we know decolonization will come mainly after Dr. King is killed, but he is focusing on that in some of his speeches that he gives towards the end of his life. And then finally, right, there's a bunch of other issues, but then social justice, right, is another focus of Dr. King. So when thinking about this, right, human rights, this will help us to start to frame the situation that's currently happening in the United States, while also drawing a clear connection to some of the teachings of Dr. King. And I should note for any historians watching, right, this talk may be considered a King-centric narrative. In the field of history, right, we tried to move away from only focusing on Dr. King to bring in other voices like Angela Davis or Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael or everyday people who participated in this fight for human rights. But just for the purposes of our talk, we're only going to be focusing on MLK and his fight for human rights. So moving ahead, we have to think about why should we contextualize his actions through the lens of human rights instead of civil rights. So we have to see this situation on the ground as it relates to policing and incarceration in the United States as a human rights crisis. I apologize if you're hearing my dogs in the background. I asked my wife if she could actually try to keep them from barking, but apparently they're too excited. So hopefully that'll settle down in a second. But policing and incarceration in the United States is a human rights crisis, and that we cannot heal as a nation until we address this human rights crisis. And by contextualizing this crisis through historical thinking and understanding it as a human rights crisis, this will equip us with the necessary tools to begin securing a more just and compassionate future, which should be a goal that all of us have, no matter, from what walk of life or wherever you live or whatever you do for a living, is that we should be focusing on trying to secure a more just and compassionate future for our republic, because this has important consequences for the world, right? This has important consequences for our everyday lives, our fellow human beings who live next door to us, etc. So we need to contextualize this through historical thinking so that then we can become equipped with the necessary tools to bring about a more just future. So getting into this then, this is a provocative thought, thinking about policing as a human rights crisis in the United States. And we're not attacking police in this talk, we're just contextualizing and framing this discussion. So to introduce this idea of policing and mass incarceration, we have to understand some statistics that will help to frame this as a human rights crisis. The United States, right, the land of the free, we actually have the highest prison population in the world, despite only making up 5% of the world's population. So there's about 2.3 million Americans currently incarcerated in the United States, which amounts to about 25% of the world's prison population. And this is a fairly recent development, historically speaking, right? In 1970, there were about 200,000 Americans who were incarcerated. Now there's 2.3 million Americans. So this has been a very clear jump over recent years, historically speaking. And when we dive deeper, if that statistic isn't alarming enough, that we make up 25% of the world's prison population, despite only making up 5% of the world's population, things only get more scary as we dive deeper into these numbers, is that incarceration rates disproportionately affect African Americans. 1 in 3 Black males can expect to go to jail in their lifetime, in comparison to 1 in 12 white males. Now, 1 in 12 white males, that's a scary enough number, right? That's a very scary idea that 1 in 12 people can expect to go to jail in their lifetime. But then, my God, when we think of 1 in 3, right, that's even more alarming and more troubling, which hits at this point of it as a human rights crisis. And since 1 in 3 Black males can expect to go to jail in their lifetime, and since the majority, right, when you think of this process, now women are becoming the fastest growing incarcerated population. It's almost as if the state has locked up all of the men, right? So now it needs to change gears and focus on locking up women. So thinking about this reflects a human rights crisis. This is just an intro. So now we need to take a step back and ask ourselves why, right? Why does this happen in the United States, the land of the free, right? A country that prides itself on liberty, equality, those kinds of things. Why is this the way it is? And it doesn't have to be like this, right? And I hope that's what this talk can maybe illuminate in our minds, is that it doesn't have to be like this. But there's 2 reasons why we are the way we are right now in the United States. And this has to do with the history and legacy of slavery. And I would love to give a talk on that topic as well, because this goes all the way back to the first settlers in the United States, right? 1619, we can trace back to the first enslaved Africans brought to the shores of the present day United States. But we don't have time to go through all of that. So most importantly for our purposes, the way to understand why this is the way it is we can look at the policing system that emerged after the Civil War, right? The most bloodiest war in United States history, where over 700,000 Americans died in that war that was fought, right, to crush the slave state, the Confederate States of America, and to emancipate slaves living there. So after the Civil War, right, what we see is the beginnings of where we are today. And this emerged through what historians and what people at the time also called black codes. Now, these black codes come from older slave codes that existed during the time of slavery, but we're mainly going to be looking at black codes. So by 1865, right, tomorrow is Juneteenth, that commemorates the final proclamation in Texas of slavery ending during the Civil War. But by 1865, 4 million African Americans who had lived in bondage were freed practically overnight. Now, the Southern aristocracy that had made its millions of dollars through slavery, chattel slavery in particular, was alarmed by this, right? Is that they are going to lose economic power now that their main labor force has been freed, because they no longer can control them if they are no longer enslaved, right? So 4 million African Americans are freed practically overnight by 1865. So the response to this by Southern states, mainly the Southern aristocracy, right, who had benefited from this agrarian slave system in the South for centuries, right, they immediately get to work on creating black codes, which codified freedmen, those who were freed, as second-class citizens. And black codes restricted everything from voting rights, and we'll talk about this, voting rights. So if a white individual in the South assaulted you, let's say, violently, you couldn't seek any justice, right? Because it would be illegal for you to testify against a white individual if you were black. Also, it banned freedmen from serving on juries, right? So if there is a African American who is a defendant in a crime, they're not going to have a jury of their peers. It's going to be a jury picked by, right, by the powers that be, essentially. And then it also required, these black codes required African Americans to sign yearly labor contracts under the threat of arrest. So quite literally, these cases show us how policing emerges. So as an example, right, let's say you are a farmer in the South and you go to an African-American individual and you say, I am going to need you for a year to work on my tobacco field, and you are going to sign this labor contract in which you will be monetarily compensated for your labor, but you have to sign this contract. And let's say this individual says, I don't really want to work for you, right? I'm a freedman now, and I don't want to work on your tobacco plantation. Well, then that farmer then had the right, according to these black codes, to literally call the police and then police that individual into either A, signing the contract, or B, going to jail, right? So this is a problem. If the Civil War is fought over trying to secure a more equal society, black codes are inherently preventing that from happening. And in the North, right, there's a lot of political debate, often as there is in the United States, about something needs to be done, right? And Northern Republicans in particular, and some Northern Democrats are protesting the implementation of these black codes. They're arguing that President Johnson, who comes after Abraham Lincoln, and who had obvious connections with the South, right, and the Southern aristocracy. They're arguing he sided with racist Southerners who are allowing this to happen, and that eventually federal Reconstruction policy officially banned black codes in the South, but states found ways to work around these federal policies and to continue this binary racial system in the South of white domination over black. So this system is what emerges after the Civil War, and it operates through policing, right? Here is an example here where there is a freedman. This comes from Harper's Weekly. It's a political cartoon from 1876 where a freedman is trying to go to the ballot box, right? And he has his voting ticket there, and it says the Democratic ticket on it. And, you know, these individuals who are policing him with guns to his head are telling him, you will vote for the Southern Democrats. You're not going to be putting any voting ticket into the Republican box because, right, we will kill you otherwise, quite literally. For freedmen exercising their right to vote, if they didn't vote in the way that the Southern system demanded, they could expect retribution from individuals in those communities that oftentimes would lead to death, right, through lynching and other forms of terrorism and murder. So this is a problem at the time that the North is aware of, but due to the political situation at the time, due to changes that are happening in federal policy out West, in particular with conflicts with Native Americans, et cetera, is that the federal kind of involvement in trying to prevent this from happening, the federal involvement just isn't there. Right. And so the South is able to try to reintroduce, right, policies from the time of slavery to keep African Americans under their control. And the way they're doing this is through policing powers. So we have to recognize that, right? For many black communities in the South, they've been dealing with, over surveillance, over regulation as it relates to policing in their communities, going all the way back to the moments after the Civil War when they became free. Right, when they were emancipated, is that almost right after that, right, they're already being told what they can and can't do, and it's operating through this idea of law, right, that the law says you can't do this. So if you do something that you have the right to do federally, but you violate this law that's local, we can then imprison you or use police powers to hurt you, etc. So we can see why today, right, there is issues with policing in black communities that we can stretch all the way back to the years after the Civil War. But I am starting to ramble a little bit, so we'll move on to Jim Crow laws, which may be more familiar to us. We may have heard this. You know, a lot of this information is what we get in our social studies class in high school, in grade school. And this term Jim Crow laws, if you're watching in the UK, they may be wondering, where does this term come from, right? It's not related to an individual, a missionary who went to China. Jim Crow comes from an old minstrel show, Jumpin' Jim Crow, and this term became used to describe as a racist slur, right, against African Americans, particularly males. They became called Jim Crow, and there's a variety of other terrible terms that were used, but we now use the term Jim Crow laws to explain this kind of apartheid system that emerged in the late 1800s. So by the late 1800s, at the end of the 19th century, the South which had been working to re-enslave the freed population through the law, further codified African-American second-class citizenship status through Jim Crow laws. And these Jim Crow laws were essentially updated black codes, right, to fit the modern world now. Because, right, during the late 1800s, the South is starting to industrialize along with the rest of the United States, and that Southern states wanted laws on the books that reflected, right, the kind of modern state of things. One of the most obvious ones that we may be familiar with is the drinking fountains, right? Is that in the Jim Crow South, it was legally mandated that you needed to have a drinking fountain for white individuals, and then quote unquote colored individuals could only use this other drinking fountain. So if a black individual decided, hey, I want to go to that white drinking fountain to get a drink there, let's say, that's illegal, right? So then law enforcement agents would come and imprison you for violating that law. Same with seating on public transit, right? In the 1890s, there's a series of trolley car boycotts. There's a great book called Right to Ride about, the trolley car boycotts where, because African Americans were segregated, in trolley cars, and then this would turn into bus seating and all of that with Rosa Parks as well. But basically, these laws are set up to serve as a constant reminder to African Americans, first, that you are not equal to white Americans, therefore you are not a true American, and that if you violate these laws, the police will come and beat you up, throw you in jail, and all of these things, right? So it's a system that operates through fear, surveillance, right? And one could argue terrorism, right? As a function of that. And this all gets supported right at the federal level. In 1896, the Supreme Court actually weighs in on this, and there would be a whole other discussion about that, which I'm not an expert on. But what the Supreme Court concluded in Plessy v. Ferguson is that actually segregation laws in the South don't violate any civil rights statutes, federally speaking, as long as the facilities were equal. This is where we get the idea that you can have separate but equal facilities. So when you have a drinking fountain, right, you can't have a white drinking fountain and then a bucket of water for African Americans, because those are not equal ways to distribute water. So you have to have an actual fountain, in both instances. Otherwise, you would be in violation of federal law. So by, having this segregation, it's not in violation because they're equal. Now, we know that that's inherently, there is no equality there when you do that, but that's how the Supreme Court came to that idea. And what we call this, right, in law or history or politics, is this is de jure segregation, right? This is segregation through the law, is that the law is designed to segregate individuals, and that then police officers can enforce those laws and imprison you if you violate those laws. And this is what Dr. King is fighting against, right, and marching against along with other activists in Montgomery, Selma, etc., is that they're working to end Jim Crow laws, which actually would not be overturned until the 1950s. The starting point with that, of course, is Brown v. Board of Education, where the Supreme Court ruled that you can't have segregated schools because by definition, there's inequality there, right? To have people walk across, town in Topeka, Kansas, this is Brown v. Board of Education, to go to one school when they have a school 2 blocks away, there's no equality there, right? So by the mid 1950s and then into the 1960s, these Jim Crow laws would be repealed, right? But these exist, and the way they were enforced is through policing. So again, we can see the historical contours here at work, how individuals are being told what they can and can't do, and that if they violate something as simple as sitting on the bus, they can expect to go to jail, right? You can see the problem here. Now, obviously, there had been work by activists to end this, and thankfully, Jim Crow laws were overturned. But although Jim Crow laws are overturned, de jure segregation, if you will, there's something else at work here. And maybe you would want to look into this book by a famous historian, Thomas Segru, who gets into this concept of de facto segregation, right? If de jure segregation relates to legal laws that segregate you, what about segregation that is not in the law? Segregation as a matter of fact, if you will, right? So his book, Sweet Land of Liberty, looks at de facto segregation in the North, right? Is that the North oftentimes remembers itself as the noble place during this time, because in the North, there's no Jim Crow laws on the books. You know, we don't have those kinds of things like the Southerners do, etc. But as we know, de facto segregation existed in the North during the same time, and de facto segregation continues to exist in the United States. And as an example, de facto segregation could be something along the lines of bank mortgages, redlining, and not offering a mortgage to a Black individual in comparison to a white individual. Now, there's no law that says a bank has to only give mortgages to white individuals. There's no law in the North that says that, but a bank could make a choice to not, right, give a mortgage to an African American individual. So that makes then that community segregated, because then they can control where people can and can't live. So we should think of de facto segregation as a choice, right, that you make. You choose, right, to segregate someone. There's no law that's telling you you have to segregate someone. This is a choice that you make. And what Sweet Land of Liberty shows us is that throughout the North, places like Detroit, Toledo, Philadelphia, he focuses mainly on the states that had the long, hot summers of the 60s, is that they had some of the worst cases of de facto segregation in the North. Everything from restaurants, hotels, mortgages, as I mentioned, employment opportunities, all of these different things existed and still exist in some ways today. So although Jim Crow laws, de jure segregation has ended, de facto segregation is still alive today. And we mainly see that in education and property taxes as it relates to elementary school funding, et cetera, and so on, right? We're not going to talk too in-depthly about that. But if you're interested to learn more, I don't make any money by plugging this book, but Sweet Land of Liberty, right, is a great start to understanding some of these issues as it relates to de facto segregation. So moving on from that, right, we need to start connecting the recent past of the post-war era to the present, because there are a lot of moving parts right now in the United States. There are a lot of positive changes that are happening, right, at local levels, municipal levels, state levels, and then in some ways at the federal level with the recent executive order, but mainly the positive changes have occurred at the state level and city levels. So we need to connect the recent past to the present to understand this issue of policing and mass incarceration. We see the threads before the post-war era. Now we're going to pull those threads through to the years after World War II to really dive into this issue, to understand it and to contextualize it. So a great place to start with mass incarceration and why things are the way they are comes from a book by a historian of the name Elizabeth Hinton, right? And what Dr. Hinton shows in the book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, is how mass incarceration and the carceral state, as it's called, right? How do we get to 2.3 million Americans behind bars when there was only 200,000 in the 1970s? And her book gets at the heart of that issue. Because for years, historians, as we tend to do, always like to debate when things start, right? And that initially, we should think of mass incarceration with President Clinton's crime bill, right, in the 1990s, and this concept of the super predator, and we're going to do the 3 strikes rule, and that leads to an increase in surveillance and imprisonment, which it did. But then historians say, well, let's go back later, or earlier actually, to the Reagan administration's war on drugs, right, and attempts to get drugs off the street, because that has a direct link to mass incarceration. And then books come out and historians continue to argue, and they say, well, wait a minute, we have to get back to Nixon's presidency, right? He ran on a platform of law and order, right? I'm going to restore law and order, and we need to think of that as the start of this issue. And for years, that's usually where historians agreed the carceral state really starts to bubble, right, is during the Nixon administration. But what Hinton shows in her research in this book that came out only about 4 years ago is that actually we can see the threads of this starting in LBJ's Great Society, right? And LBJ as an individual, he had experienced poverty firsthand. He was a teacher in Texas, right? He had seen impoverished immigrant families. He understood poverty. And LBJ, as he gets involved in politics, he admired FDR. And LBJ, was a megalomaniac in some ways. And what he determined is, I'm going to overshadow FDR. is that someday people will remember me more than people remember FDR. And the way I'm going to do that is through my Great Society plan, right? So I'm going to tackle civil rights, I'm going to tackle healthcare, and I'm going to tackle crime, poverty, all of these issues, employment, etc. So LBJ, in his attempts to overshadow his quote unquote political daddy, FDR, decides, well, one of the things as part of the Great Society plan will be the war on poverty, is that we need to get poverty out of American cities in order to uplift society, right, and do these things. And I'm not, this isn't a whole attack on LBJ, right? Medicare, Medicaid, great programs, but the other policies of the Great Society, not so much. Actually, in my history classes, we spend, I think, about a week or two on LBJ's Great Society and problematize it, etc. But for our purposes, just to keep things short, right, is what Hinton's book shows us is how LBJ viewed police as the frontline soldiers in the fight against poverty. And you can see here where some issues start to come up. Because if LBJ is viewing police as soldiers, he says that police need to be equipped like soldiers, right? So federal funds start to pour into local police departments where they get outfitted with state-of-the-art surveillance technologies, right? State-of-the-art weapons and all kinds of different equipment. Because for LBJ, the way to end, right, poverty is to make sure you have police there, right? And that's not really the way you want to go about solving poverty, right? Is having individuals who live in impoverished communities be under constant surveillance, right? And be over policed, because that's not going to actually solve economic issues. And as we know, watching history unfold, is that that kind of approach hasn't worked, because there's still many cities in the United States that have, you know, an over policed kind of system, but poverty is still there, and poverty continues to grow in those places. So if you're interested in learning more about the connection there from the war on poverty to the war on crime, I suggest, you know, picking up the book from the library, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. It's a riveting kind of examination of how this this carceral state starts with LBJ's Great Society. So moving on from that, right, we understand that LBJ, Nixon, you know, all of these presidents had federal policies that led to over-policing some communities and under-policing other communities. But that's still not enough to understand where we are today. And what I would argue is that we also have to understand the global dimensions of this, the Cold War context, right? Is that during the Cold War, if you were alive during it, or if you've studied it, is that the modus operandi, right, of the national security state, the United States, is to defeat Bolshevism or the Soviet Union, and they're going to stop the spread of communism or socialism at any, you know, in any way they can, to contain the current borders of communism, containment theory, domino theory, etc. So, you know, this is where we get the Korean War, the Vietnam War, etc. But in the 1980s, right, in particular in Latin and South America, there's a fear that left-wing groups are going to gain more legitimacy and that they are going to win elections, and that then they'll create relationships with the Soviet Union, and that the US would lose control over its former client states in Latin and South America. And one place in particular where this occurred was in Nicaragua. And you may be thinking, how does Nicaragua have anything to do with mass incarceration in Detroit, let's say? Well, it has a very clear connection, and this relates to recently declassified information that you can look up through the NSA website, the National Archives. All of those different government agencies have declassified the majority of the information I'm about to explain. So in Nicaragua, during the late 1970s, there is a movement by the Sandinistas to form a new government. And when the rebels finally form a new government, the United States cannot allow that to happen because they are a left-wing organization, and that, you know, they may have ties to the Soviet Union. So in response to this, the United States creates a group called the Counter-Revolutionary Contras. And this is actually detailed in the National Security Decision Directive number 17, signed January 4th, 1982. You can type that into Google and it'll pop up. And President Reagan at the time is outlining his vision of Latin and South America and the Caribbean as well, and how the United States is going to start funneling money into groups that will fight against left-wing regimes. Now, several U.S. allies and U.S. groups called the Contras terrorists. The CIA had created this organization, but when they were supposedly fighting the Sandinistas, the Contras were doing a lot of different things like extortion, rape, murder, extrajudicial killings that had nothing to do with their fight against the Sandinistas. So this was a terrorist group, and we have to recognize that. And I'm not going to get into too much of detail about that. But again, what does this have to do with mass incarceration? Well, one of the ways that the Contras actually got money was through their connections to Colombian drug cartels and other drug cartels in that region, particularly in the cocaine trade. And the United States, right, is aware of this. Just as a quick back note, right, the U.S. had invaded Nicaragua several times. It actually occupied Nicaragua from 1912 to 1933, kind of like the Iraq War, if you ever want to research that, where, you know, we occupied it for over a decade. But then the Great Depression happened, so then FDR pulls all the troops out of Nicaragua because they had sent them there to overthrow this dictator, kind of like what we did with Saddam Hussein, etc. But either way, the Contras are working to gain money by connecting themselves to drug cartels. And the United States government, as recently declassified information has shown us, is aware of this, right? And that they are turning a blind eye to the Contras getting involved in the drug trade. Now, a journalist by the name of Gary Webb had called this the Dark Alliance, right? And he actually, you know, wrote a book about this before any of this information had been declassified. Unfortunately, he died. But his book is a great starting point if you want to learn about this, but then you can also research this through government websites as well. So essentially what happens is that the Contras are getting money by selling cocaine to the United States. And then that money is getting sent to Iran, for instance, to buy Kalashnikov rifles that are pictured here, the Iran-Contra scandal, as it's called. But either way, as cocaine is funneling into the United States, right, the US government is doing little to prevent it, even though in the mid-1980s, the Reagan administration passes the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1985, I believe it was. You know, we're going to get drugs off the street, et cetera, while behind closed doors, the intelligence agencies are allowing, you know, drugs to pour into American communities. Again, you're asking, what does this have to do with mass incarceration? Well, one of the ways we can understand this is that the cocaine that comes into the United States gets processed into something called crack cocaine. And this occurs through a processing with baking soda, I believe, where then it's turned into rock form, it's boiled, and then it hardens into rock form. And then it's basically a processed form of powdered cocaine that can be sold more cheaply. It's cheaper than powdered cocaine. For my improper grammar there, is that it's cheaper than powdered cocaine, so you can sell more of it and increase your profits, etc. It just so happened to be that the communities with the crack epidemic, as it was called, were communities with African Americans, while powdered cocaine of the 1980s, which millions of Americans were using, was mainly used by white Americans. So the drugs have the same effect. Crack cocaine has the exact physiological effect as powdered cocaine. You know, it enters your body quicker though when you smoke rock cocaine versus you know, snorting powdered cocaine. But it's the same exact drug having the same exact reaction to your body. It's just one group is using one form and another group is using another form. I'm going to skip past the Boland amendments to get into the quote unquote crack epidemic, because as I mentioned, right, police had been tasked by LBJ to surveil and be present in many cities across the United States. And in many inner cities, there are a lot of police already there. And US media latches onto the use of crack cocaine as an epidemic that is destroying Black America, which in all reality, right, cocaine in general was destroying all communities in the United States, but it's just that crack is framed as a Black problem, right? And that we need to get dealers, users off the street because they're creating poverty in their community, they're devastating families, people are dying, all of these things. Meanwhile, although white communities are using cocaine at the same amount, when you look at the statistics, there's no difference in the amount of being used from each community. It's just that we're going to enforce drug laws on one community more than the other. And the apparatus to do so was already there. So the reason I have the crack epidemic in quotation marks is that it was really a cocaine epidemic. It's just that when we even hear the term crack, right, mentally your brain may produce a pictorial representation of images seen here, right, because you've been conditioned to see crack cocaine as this problem that only affected Black communities and that white communities were fine during the 1980s. So drug laws are being enforced, right, unequally in American society, and through laws and the enforcement of those laws, certain groups are getting locked up more than other groups. So it's a startling kind of conclusion to this long process that had started with LBJ's Great Society and trying to end poverty. So let's take this a step further and see where we have ended up because of drug laws. And some of these ideas come from the famous book that came out about 10 years ago, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And I'm going to push back on this book a little bit and argue something else. But what her book shows us is that through the enforcement of drug laws, which are divided along racial lines, right, Black communities have been abandoned by the American government and society. And when you're saying the enforcement of drug laws divided along racial lines, what do you mean by that? Well, the possession of a few rocks of cocaine carried with it a potentially devastating prison sentence in comparison to the same weight of powdered cocaine. So if a Black individual is pulled over by police and they find 5 rocks of cocaine, sentenced to jail for 40 years, right? I'm making up the sentencing numbers. But a white individual in the same day is pulled over with powdered cocaine, usually a slap on the wrist, maybe some support to enter into rehab or serve a light jail sentence for a year or two, right? Is that the enforcement of drug laws are happening along racial lines. And through this represents the abandonment of Black America, right? Mainly through these drug laws, and that what has happened to these communities is directly related to that. And so this abandonment has affected everything from health to culture, right? Many cities in the industrial north in particular were devastated by the enforcement of these drug laws. And the American Black community has been aware of this since it started, right? They've worked to end this. They've been vocal about this. They've continued to do demonstrations and marches since this started. While many white communities have been largely unaware of this, or at least choose to ignore it. And this only leads to more tensions in American society, the tensions that we're seeing now, right? I saw on a television news station, there was a talking head who said, well, I don't really understand why Black Americans are so upset about policing, right? And it's like, well, maybe if you did the research or you learned about this, you may be able to understand why that's the case. Thankfully, though, in terms of generational divides, the majority of young Americans recognize this issue, right? And that we've seen in these recent marches, the most diverse marches in US history, right? People from all walks of life, race, gender, sexuality, etc., all marching together to try to reform policing and incarceration in the United States. So it is a generational issue. Now, here's where I want to push back a little bit, and I'm not so much pushing back, I'm just adding my own ideas to this, because Michelle Alexander does get into this topic of the private prison industry. But this is the tipping point for where we need to be focusing some attention for the remainder of the presentation, is that the private prison industry has exploded over recent years as the drug war, quote unquote, has been fought. And private prisons are prisons just that are privately owned corporations. They're actually traded on the stock market, right? These are not prisons that are owned by the state, right? These are prisons that are owned by corporations. And they are literally in the business of getting people locked up. And this is it's been a very insidious, a slow kind of creep, if you will, but it's created a very scary situation to the point where we're almost to a new form of slavery. And I'll explain why. Is that 65% of privately owned prisons require occupancy guarantees. Now, state-owned prisons don't do that, right? If they're, they have prisoners, it is what it is. But a privately owned prison, since it operates through the profit motive, it says, hey, we're not a profitable entity if prison A only has 70% of cells full of individuals. We can only become profitable when 85% of cells are occupied at any time. So a privately owned prison firm will go to a small community and say, hey, we want to build a prison here, right? We want to build this prison. It's going to be state of the art. It's going to have all these modern things to it, and that it's going to create construction jobs for your industry. It's going to create jobs for the workers in the prison, right? It's going to create all kinds of economic benefits to your community, but that you have to promise us, right, that you will make sure that we have prisoners, that we have a steady stream of prisoners. So then police departments are then tasked through their municipal governments to literally go out and arrest people, right? And it just so happens to be that one community of Americans, African Americans, are already over-policed. So in communities where you have over-policing, it's going to be easier to find new prisoners. Even if an individual hasn't committed a crime, they may be randomly stopped on the street. They may say, something that an officer doesn't like. Well, then, the officer can arrest them and throw them into this privately owned prison. And then we know the snowballing effect of that. Or in more tragic cases, as we've seen recently, an individual can be stopped on the street for suspicion of a very nonviolent crime and end up being murdered over it. So this is a lot of money at work here, right? The private prison industry is actually worth over $70 billion. And numerous private prison industries donate to political campaigns, right? I mean, this is all public record. And they have lobbying firms that ensure they continue to get new prisoners. And really what they're ensuring that they continue to do is to get a new labor force. This is where we start to see new slavery coming back to the United States as it relates to policing and incarceration. Because in privately owned prisons, you can manufacture whatever you want to, right? Now in a state prison, you may make license plates or something. Maybe an inmate, stamps license plates to make license plates affordable for the everyday person who owns a car. Well, a privately owned prison may look at those license plates and say, that's not very profitable. But what about if we made uniforms for McDonald's workers? Let's have our prisoners do that, right? And actually, McDonald's has received uniforms made from prisoners in privately owned prisons. Or the automotive industry, right? We don't want to have to deal with the UAW anymore in negotiating contracts. So let's see what else we can do about that. Now, Honda, right, is one car company that used prison labor to create car parts, in particular upholstery seating for, I think, their Civic model. A lot of those were made in privately owned prisons. Walmart is notorious for this. A lot of the produce, right, that you get at Walmart tends to not come from farms, but gardens in privately owned prisons. And there's a whole host of companies that are guilty of this. Whole Foods, which prides itself as this kind of ethical company, right? We're so good and great, and all of these things, actually got in a lot of trouble, I believe, about 3 years ago when it was revealed that they use prison labor as well. So you're saying, how is this slavery? Well, first of all, the whole system is set up to capture people, to put them to work in the prisons, right? Because the wages that an inmate receives in these privately owned prisons are paid anywhere between 23 cents to $2 an hour. And if you have a privately owned prison, you don't follow the same kinds of rules that a normal kind of prison follows. So maybe toothpaste in the prison store costs $8, right, for Crest toothpaste or something like that. And I'm making this up, obviously, right? I don't know the price. I'm just saying $8. And that if you're only making $2 an hour, right, making uniforms for McDonald's, and you got to pay $8 for toothpaste to brush your teeth, dental health obviously is the root of all health, right? That's a problem there. Now, if you're making 23 cents an hour, how are you ever going to afford toothpaste, right? You're pretty much stuck into perpetual servitude, indentured servitude in some ways, but really slavery, because this system is set up to ensure that people don't get out, right? And that if they do get released because they serve the sentence, that they get re-imprisoned. Because as we know in the United States, many states do not allow ex-felons to vote. Ex-felons are still used and counted for congressional districts, but they don't have the ability to vote, so they can't work to try to end, the private prison industry or something like that. So it's a system that benefits itself at the expense of one group. So Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, gets us to think about this. And I would argue we need to start thinking more and more about the private prison industry and the connection between local governments and this industry. As a quick side note, to give an example of how this works in over-policing and things like that, is in Ferguson, Missouri, right, that suburb where there was a killing there, is that one of the ways that city government made money was through tickets and arrests. It made a lot of money off of that. And when this happened in 2015, it became revealed that the police were only focusing on one community to raise revenue for the city. So again, you can kind of see the surveillance state, this apparatus designed to only affect one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. So we're going to move on, right? We're towards the end of this presentation. I realize that it's been an hour, so we will move on. But really quickly, I wanted to go over what we're seeing today, right? Because we've seen the kind of delineating features of this. We've seen the threads come through, and that it was very scary a couple weeks ago, right? We saw a lot of civil unrest, frustrations, right? Especially in Minneapolis, which has a history of these murders. I mean, George Floyd wasn't the first. Philando Castile, right? Jamar Clark, etc. They burned down some buildings in this rioting. Is that we saw this same kind of response to injustice and human rights violations during the late 1960s. This term starts from 1967 with the long hot summer, right? And then it morphed into the long hot summers. And the chilling solutions, the responses to this civil unrest, has been to only increase policing in these communities after rioting takes place. Pictured there is actually an image from a riot that took place in Detroit, Michigan during the long hot summers. One of the more intense riots took place in Detroit, Toledo area. So the solutions to this have often been just police the places more. And this policing apparatus, this surveillance kind of apparatus, if you will, is only intensified in these communities, which then only increases the likelihood that something like the murder of George Floyd would happen, right? If your solution to unrest is then to just increase policing in a community, the tensions are already there. They've been there for centuries. Now you're only making it more likely to happen again. So the reason I make the connection here is that what we're seeing with civil unrest in some cities, which that was in the immediate days after the murder of George Floyd, and now the marches have been largely peaceful, is that this is not new for us as American citizens. We've had these long hot summers before, and that if we continue to do the chilling solutions, which is just to over police these communities, we're only going to see this replay. And again, the fierce urgency of now, right? Dr. King is talking about this in the 1960s. So if anything, it's even more urgent in 2020. So moving on from that, right, I want to raise this idea of what can we do, right? What are we to do with this information? What are we to go about doing? Well, some communities have already taken steps, towards a more public safety kind of model, recognizing that you shouldn't have police officers in schools, right? That you shouldn't have plainclothes officers patrolling streets, which in any other country, when we see plainclothes officers, as we call them here, which is like undercover, if I'm using that term correctly, undercover police who wear normal clothes and drive normal cars. When, let's say, the nation of Georgia has a undercover plainclothes officer, we call them secret police, right? The Soviet Union, we always said, had the secret police. There's the Gestapo. That's what plainclothes officers are. It's just that in the United States, we call them that. But that there's this whole apparatus there at work, right? You have uniformed officers patrolling streets. You have plainclothes officers patrolling streets. You have cameras at various corners, always blinking blue lights, right? As you can see in Toledo, that's constantly surveilling. Is that these communities, right, are dealing with a lot, and that there's constant reminders of this injustice. So what can we do, right? I would say the first thing that we need to do is learn history, right? As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, it's important to us to learn the history of this. And there's a lot more to learn. So maybe this talk hopefully gave you some ideas on things that you would like to learn more about, and then you can do research or contact your local librarian who could put you in touch with resources, or contact me, and I can, you know, I would have no problem suggesting things. And then once we learn history, we have to learn from it, right, to make sure we don't continue to do the things that we do. And then third, the big issue now I see that's been politicized is we need to recognize that Black Lives Matter, right? There's been this very bizarre kind of backlash to Black Lives Matter with the phrase all lives matter. Well, yes, all lives will matter once Black Lives matter, right? So we have to understand that right now there's a disproportionate kind of system in place that shows Black lives do not matter, because Black individuals can expect to go to jail at a higher rate than individuals who are not Black, right? They're oftentimes killed in encounters with police officers. They're under a constant state of surveillance, right, from police. And I'm talking about police in schools, the criminalization of Black youth, all the way to adults driving a car or walking down the street and being suspected of selling a loose cigarette or something like that, is that they can expect to be policed. And that goes all the way back to the years after Reconstruction. So I think Black Lives Matter is this good starting point, because it gives us a vision of what the future can be, right, of racial justice, is that as a republic, as a nation state, we have to make sure we achieve those human rights of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. We've already achieved the civil rights. That doesn't mean the work is done, right? Yes, there are no more Jim Crow laws. That is great and good, but there are still these human rights crises that are continuing to replay and replay and replay. And I think it's great that the Black Lives Matter movement has started to bring about change in local communities. Actually, the NYPD announced that it'll no longer be using its secret police, its plainclothes officer unit will be disbanded, and those officers will have new roles. And that San Francisco now is moving towards a model of policing where you don't always need to have police officers respond to certain kinds of issues, as you can use mental health workers who can go and help people and things like that. Is that police have a lot of jobs they do, and that's intentional by LBJ's creation, right? But that we can find new ways to do this to ensure that these murders don't continue to happen. So I'm going to close out with that, and what I'll do is actually bring up the video back. I hope this talk was useful, or at least somewhat insightful. Let me switch over to video, and then maybe we could do a quick Q&A or something.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Michael. That was a very good.
Thank you.
For your first time experiencing that. Hopefully the technology worked well for you. We've had a few comments come up, questions on throughout the presentation. You might saw some of them from Sister Paulette, who's joined us this way, but if you didn't, just completely ignore them. I'll lead the question and answer session. Okay. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 so far, and okay. I can go through chronologically how they related to the topic, or there's one that's on human rights, one on separate but equal, a comment on the price of things in commissary and prison, one about the private prison industry, and another one on the militarizing of police. So we can take those in any order that makes sense to you. And if anyone listening on YouTube or otherwise has more questions, keep submitting them, and I'll be monitoring the chat.
Yeah, certainly. We can go in order. I wrote down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and these sound like great questions. And I'll preface it with, if I don't have the information, I won't lie to you. I'll let you know I don't know, because as a historian, I want to be accurate, right? So if I have to research something, I'll let you know.
That's great. And so we'll start with what came up first. So this came up in the conversation you were talking about Martin Luther King Jr.'s move from civil rights to human rights. And the question was, Sister Paulette says, am I correct in remembering while we're talking about working for human rights for all people, didn't in history we count African Americans as only 3/5 of a person or less than human?
Yes, and that's an excellent question, and a troubling reality, right, is that under the founding of the United States, right, where the 3/5 compromise and these kinds of things come from, quite literally, not viewed as human beings for a very long time until after the Civil War. Now, human beings they were considered chattel. They were considered property of the owner. Now, this is a human who have love, they have fear, these are human beings. But according to the law, so yes, I think it's an interesting connection to think about why the human rights for individuals living in the South, for a very long time, they weren't considered human beings, right? They were just told on the whim of their owner. And you know, it's a dark, there's a book called Soul by Soul that talks about the actual slave trade itself, the slave markets, and it's disgusting, right? That these are human, you know, being bought and sold like this. Now, the film 12 Years a Slave actually shows a moment where occurring and how, and it's a very accurate, in some ways, representation of how chattel slaves were viewed. So yeah, that for a long time, slaves were counted as three-fifths of a person to make sure that the South got, you know, representatives in the House. They needed their population to go up. So they can't count a slave as a full person, because then that would prove that their whole system is wrong. So we'll count them as three-fifths of a person so that we can get more representatives in Congress to make sure then we can continue the legal protection of slavery. Essentially is what that was, you know, designed for.
Great. Another question moves on a little further in your talk where we were talking about separate by equal. You had a slide up about the water fountains. And Sister Paulette, when that came up, her question that came to her mind was, what is really underlying the idea that we thought that separate but equal was perfectly fine? How did we even get to the point where we thought that was okay? What was going on in our society?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that makes me think, I mean, I think in our society it shows, right, an acceptance of this racial, you know, caste system, this binary there of white race being supreme to all other races, but that in the North, and all of this, and not, I mean, I don't want to say that Northerners didn't protest this, because they did at that time. You know, maybe a Northerner living in Chicago would say, I'm not bondage, but it doesn't really upset me if they have a drinking fountain separated, right? And I think that maybe the reason for that, because I don't have the answer technically speaking, but I think the reason for that would be a cultural issue of how people viewed things. And I think at that time, people didn't view things necessarily in the most equal way. And that in their minds, they think they're doing the right thing, right? That shows you how demented this logic was. If you're thinking the right thing to do is to have, you know, two drinking fountains, right? So that's what I would say, I guess, to that.
Great. And here's another question that comes up, I think, going chronologically. When we're talking about the black codes and the Jim Crow laws, were they instituted nationally, or did they tend to be more localized? And were they similar from state to state, or is there a lot of variance in how they looked in our society?
That's a good question, and I can't answer that with a very, you know, well-rounded response, other than they're different, right? And in the deep South, the deep Southern states, they have, you know, some very black codes, but you know, they're different in certain states, but they're pretty much the same. A set of laws that allows us to police and control the freedmen, the new, this idea that we can create laws that prevents them from truly being free, but of each individual law. However, they are often, so these would be a local municipality would have, you know, a rule that American, you know, you have to follow these kinds of guidelines that our community has put in place, that would then be. Now, the federal government, right, outlawed this, technically speaking, during the era of Reconstruction. violates, the whole reason of the Civil War. But once I mentioned with tensions with the Native American tribes out west, called a lot of federal resources from continuing Reconstruction in the South, and then allowed these states. Did that answer the question?
I think it did. That's good. The next question is a little bit of a comment, but maybe you have something you want to say. Jamie Sue notices several, particularly on cable networks, shows about the prison life and so forth, and she's noticed on those the exorbitant costs that canteens or commissaries charge. She just wanted to comment on one show. She saw that a person was charged $60 about making $2 an hour at the high end. That's labor to buy a sweatshirt.
Yeah, that's is terrifying. And that's why I would argue it's close to a form of slavery, in the sense that you have no economic power in this kind of system. Literally, you're in a prison cell, so you can't leave these jobs that pay you nothing. And let's say you just want a sweatshirt because the blanket isn't warm enough, and then you have to work this many hours just to get a sweatshirt, and then there's probably going to be all this process. So yeah, that's one of the big issues with this private prison industry, is not only what they do with that power and what they have prisoners make and construct for them, do light produce, and then charge them all this money, so then they never actually have any money, right? If you're having to pay $60 for a sweatshirt, which I assume is probably it's probably the basic sweatshirt, so like a Fruit of the Loom or something like that.
This next question comes from a fellow academic here in Tiffin, John Bain. He says that your analysis of private prison industry is accurate, but he's wondering about the linkage between increased carceration and the private prison industry. He feels that's anecdotal, and he's doubtful that there's a linkage between the rise of private industry being linked to mass incarceration.
It wouldn't be anecdotal in the sense that we have to remember one of the reasons this industry cuts at the state level for prisons, right? Which then creates a vacuum and a need by private prisons. So I guess I understand the question, and I understand the pushback on it, but when they have required occupancy rates, right, this leads to increased arrests. Don't have. So I am, continuing. This is anecdotal, but you could probably access these. Is that, as an example, if a privately owned prison has an 85% guaranteed occupancy, then they're going to arrest people to get to that level, right? And they're going to get to that level. And that's what Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, really hits to the carceral state. Now, I didn't want to say that maybe I misspoke. Private prisons didn't start mass incarceration, right? The carceral state goes all the way back to LBJ, but that it's accelerated with the privately owned prison industry, to the defunding of, the kind of carving out of the state, if you the 1980s, in a whole variety of different services, not only prison. So I hope that answers. Great. And I appreciate the critique of what I said. It's good to.
I'll keep monitoring YouTube if there's more questions coming in, but we're down to two more. One came in before the talk, you know, we talked, Michael, about giving people the opportunity to do some pre-questioning in case they weren't able to join us live, and another one that's related to it that came up during the talk. So I'm going to say these both at the same time and let you address them. People. The one that came in ahead of time is a lament that if we could, where policing was less about shooting to kill and more about shooting to halt, because what happens is that the police force becomes judge and jury, and so there was a lament about that. Sister Paulette noted, says that as the militarizing of the it, in a way, it increases the tension about that increased tension that's caused by the militarizing of the police.
Again, I appreciate all of these, you know, questions, and the of the shoot to kill. Said when I was fighting in Fallujah, my rules of engagement were more strict than the rules of right now. Shooting in any sense, even whether it's to halt, I think is a very recognize that, which is why they introduced things like the taser, which is considered will kill you if applied in a certain way, but that, you know, in this case, it will that through the shoot to kill mentality, the shoot to stop, there's no rule judicial killing, right? Because there was no, you were innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Stop someone would be to arrest them. So by you then shooting to stop them, you've be able to defend themselves in a jury of their peers. So you've effectively become the judge, jury, and executioner. There's now an awareness of, in some of these videos that have come out recently, right? In the police officers just shooting men in the back with lethal weapons, you know, that's a through, you know, actions people are taking now that we start to work towards ending that kind of, really teaching whoever takes over the policing of a community that this cannot continue. Now, to think about militarization of the police, that's another excellent point in terms of the kinds of tension. Now, in Tiffin, Ohio, right, we live in a very defunded police situation. I think we only received about or 1.4 million from the federal government. I don't remember which one it was because I read that statistic. But a lot of local police departments receive federal funding that allows them to purchase militarized equipment that is left over from the wars and Iraq. When I lived in Kent, Ohio, when I was a graduate student, the Kent PD, they had it parked, right? And then they would have it out during Halloween time. It was an M rifle, right? Which is a, you know, an armored vehicle that's used in war, devastation, and that these policing agencies then purchase this equipment, other kinds of military hardware as well, particularly surveillance equipment and drones, right? The Seneca County sheriff possesses a very powered thermal drone that is accurate to 400 feet or something like that. I recently learned is that those kinds of can increase tensions, because then it looks like not only are the police here to survive, that they are soldiers and that they're viewing this as a war. Why else would they have an armored vehicle, right? So I could see, if that answers your question, I could see why the militarization of police, and it only will continue to do so, which is why many people argue the first step we need to make in this first. Then we can start to do these other things. And, you know, a local police precinct MRAP, you know, truck to patrol this, the streets can't even hold the weight of those vehicles. for these military kinds of things. So yeah, I think that that's a huge and scary issue. The militarized industrial complex is you got to sell these things to make money, and that's what it is, and hopefully it'll change soon.
Great. That wraps up. I want to say, along with others, very much we appreciate your time and effort to do this as a service for the city of Tiffin, our community, and as you know, more broadly, I know some of the people personally are from like Indiana and Illinois, and there's interest in the UK that will be watching this as a recording because they have great interest in what's happening in our society. Thank you very much for that.
Excellent. I appreciate all the feedback. To interrupt, because I want to address some of these things on a more kind of with research. Name, it's my private email, michaeldanielgoodnough@gmail.com, and then you can use Facebook or some other. I appreciate the opportunity to do this. Again, to the Reverend Gerlach, thank you for letting me use this. I'm not part of the church, and you welcomed me to do this, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Continue to be in conversation, Michael and I. If anyone who's watching this recording live or as a recording is interested in further historical perspective on what's happening currently, let myself or Michael know, and we will see if there's a way of facilitating a conversation online about that. I think that we both have great in that objective.
Certainly. Excellent.
Great. All right.
Well, thank you all.
I think that is it.
Thanks again, and thanks to all who watched, and I appreciate it. Again, I can't say thank you enough, because this is great. Opportunities, these things that need to be talked about. So thank you.
You're welcome. And for anyone who watched, someone I knew watched this recording is going to be available in perpetuity, the same way that you accessed it now. What will happen between now and say a couple hours is I'll be cutting out the live time before the presentation, right, that we had up so that you knew that we were here. So it will be shortened to cut all that out, but the Q&A and be available for you to share with anyone you'd like. And thank you all. That will end tonight's presentation.
Perfect. Goodbye, everyone.